Welcome everyone to our webinar on preschool suspension and expulsion. We're really excited that you all have decided to join us here today, and we hope that this webinar will be both interactive as much as a webinar can be, and as well as informative. So please feel free to to ask questions during the presentation by using the chat function. Or the question. I think we actually have a question and answer function as well. Or you can wait until the end to ask any remaining questions that you may have, because we have a lot of time for that. So I will go ahead and get us started. So when we talk about preschool suspension and expulsion here at ICS, we do so because it is something that is very central to our mission as an early childhood organization. Our mission, of course, being ensuring the success of all young children. And those of you who may have seen the marketing for this webinar, you might have seen that we said that there are some inherent biases that are present when we look into the research on preschool suspension and expulsion. And so if we know that there are certain groups that are disproportionately affected by this in early childhood, then it is indeed something that is really important to us. And we want to make sure that, that there are ways of addressing this in early childhood. So we are here today to hopefully educate you on this topic, but also to provide some strategies moving forward for how we can address preschool suspension and expulsion. Next slide. So here you'll see the overview of today's agenda. After giving an overview of the issue of preschool suspension and expulsion, we'll begin talking about the impact that the issue has on children. And then, as I mentioned before, what we can do to tackle preschool suspension and expulsion. In other words, we don't want you to leave here today just feeling down and saying, oh my goodness, this is awful, or even, you know, I don't see the big deal, without having something tangible that you may be able to do today after this webinar or in the coming weeks. And it could be something as simple as advocating. And then finally, we will talk a bit about what it means for us to proceed with equity in mind as an organization and as individuals who care about the well-being of children. So just making sure that we are all aware of what it means when we refer to suspension and expulsion. So suspension, the biggest difference is that one is temporary and one is permanent. So suspension, of course, would be the temporary removal from the classroom or learning area. And expulsion would be the permanent dismissal from school or program. Both are generally done in response to what is referred to as problem behavior. Something that I do want to highlight about suspension, and you know, and I'll tell you that I've been kind of in the weeds of the research on this topic for a while now, and as an organization, definitely for several years. And I feel like I'm still learning new things each time I present or each time I meet other colleagues who are also doing research on this topic. And something that I think is good to note is that suspension doesn't always look like a child being yelled at and thrown out of the classroom and sent home, right? There's in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension. It can be something as seemingly harmful as, well, you know, little John has to stay with the child care center director for the rest of the day. So while he is not being sent home, he still is being taken out of his learning environment and missing out on some key time with his classmates and his teachers. So it doesn't, you know, suspension can take different forms. So I think it's just important for us to know. All right, so I did mention that I'd like this to be an interactive webinar. So we are going to start off with a poll question and just kind of gauge the knowledge that you all have. So the majority of you all, 46% said 250 children are suspended or expelled from preschool each day. The next highest count was 100 children each day. And then we have 23% that said 200. No one chose fewer than 50. So it turns out that the majority of you are correct. And we can go to our next slide. And it is that 250 preschoolers are suspended or expelled from school every day. And this is really, if you really think about it, it's a staggering statistic. If you think about the fact that these are 3 and 4-year-olds, you know, some of us can maybe imagine this because we've seen some quote unquote problem behavior, but others of us may just think, you know, what could these little children have done to warrant being kicked out of their learning environments to this degree. And so can we go to our next slide? This number, the number 250 per day, is actually likely an undercount. And it is because the data largely does not take into account private preschools, and the numbers of suspensions and expulsions in those schools are known to be twice as high as public preschools on average. So we can assume from that the total number is actually higher than 250 students per day. Okay, so a question about problem behaviors. What does this actually mean for 3 and 4-year-olds? So 3 and 4-year-olds may be suspended or expelled from school for things like crying and throwing tantrums, which, you know, if you have children or you've been around children, you know that that's kind of normal at that age. Also being hyperactive. And then we have hitting or exhibiting other forms of physical aggression. And something else that I'd like to note here is in looking at research from child psychologists, many of them have said that forms of physical aggression is actually pretty normal for 3 and 4-year-olds when they have been placed into a new environment and are trying to adjust to their surroundings. Okay, so we have a couple more poll questions to, again, help us get a good background information on preschool suspension and expulsion. So which gender is more likely to be suspended or expelled? We'll give you all a few seconds to get those votes in. Okay, so everyone selected boys, and that is correct. And we'll go to our next poll question. So our next poll question, which race of young children is more likely to be suspended or expelled? And I see that we have a question in the Q&A, and after this poll, I'll go ahead and answer it. Okay, so 100% chose Black children. That is also correct. So before we get on to our next slide, we do have a question here that says, I see preschool expulsion as the terminology used. Could you please clarify if when referring to preschool or private preschool, you also include childcare programs which are not categorized as preschool? So my initial answer to this would have been yes, that the term is catch-all, but I'd like to have a moment to actually go back and look at that particular study and make sure that I'm answering you correctly. So the question is from Lorraine, Craig, and Sullivan, so I will be sure to get back to you with the definitive answer. Okay, so as you see on this slide, 82% of suspensions and expulsions, and this is not just, so 82% of suspensions and expulsions in general are boys who do not make up 82% of the school. So that's a disproportionate effect there. And Black children are 2.2 times more likely to be suspended or expelled. So again, we definitely see that this is an issue that does have a race and does have a gender. So when we look at who's really being excluded and the data behind it, we see that research has shown that there are 3 predictors, and they're referred to generally as the 3 Bs, big, Black, and boy, that essentially that if a child, a 3 or 4-year-old in school is bigger than their classmates, a Black child and a boy, they already are more likely than their classmates to be suspended or expelled than someone who might be smaller than them or smaller than the rest of their peers, or someone who is not a Black child, or simply someone who's not a boy. Here we get another overview of the issue that shows just how disproportionately out of school preschool suspensions are implemented. So the first bar graph to the far left shows overall enrollment. And this is from 2014, I believe. So it shows overall enrollment. And we see that 43% of children in preschools are white, and 4% are two or more races, 29% Hispanic or Latino, 18% Black, African American. And then we have 1, 4, and 2% for Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, Asian, and American Indian or Alaskan Native. And so what we see in the middle bar is for single out of school suspension. So those who have been suspended one time in an out of school suspension, that's 42% of those are Black children. And then if we look at out of school suspensions, multiple out of school suspensions, we see that number increases to 48%. So whereas we have 18% Black or African American in the schools, 42% of those children are have been suspended one time, and 48% more than once. All right, so we'll get into a bit of the impact on children now. And so what you'll see here is a screenshot of a recent article in The Economist. I'm sure that we all know what the world, I would say the country, but really the world has been going through with the COVID-19 pandemic, and the majority of children are out of school and have been out of school now for weeks. And so I saw this article recently, or I saw the very catchy title, "When Easing Lockdowns, Government Should Open Schools First." And so this is not ICS at all saying that this should be the case or anything like that, but I think it do points to the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic has really highlighted the concerns about children being out of school. And if we think to ourselves that, we're going through something that is, for many of us in our lifetime, unprecedented, but this is a worry that a lot of families have each day about their children, remaining out of school because it's something that happens so often to them. And others like them. So one of the quotes from this article: "Consider the cost of barring children from the classroom. In normal times, school helps level the playing field. Without it, the achievement gap between affluent and working class children will grow." So when we think of the harm in keeping children out of school, even at the young ages of 3 and 4, one of those things is simply not falling behind and not having access to the education that they would have if they were still in the classroom. So another harm to be considered is the creation of the school to prison pipeline. And this is a term that some or all of you may have heard by now. So essentially, if across the nation, if Black boys are receiving 2/3 of out of school suspensions, we then see that by the age of 18, a whopping 30% of Black boys have been arrested at least once. And by the age of 23, that ends up being almost half of Black men, young Black men. So this statistic and this conversation came specifically from an article entitled "Black Boys in Crisis, Is Punishment Too Harsh?" But generally, those who are in the thick of the research around the school to prison pipeline are familiar with this phenomenon. So it's something for all of us to consider, that if a child is not able to remain in the classroom, which is where we expect children to be able to learn and grow and develop, eventually there are other areas where a child will turn, or a school is no longer a safe haven. And I'll actually go to the next slide. So the author and activist Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a book, Between the World and Me, and he is a Black man, and it was considered a letter to his son. And there are sections of the very short book that do talk about education and his own experiences with the education system and the warnings that he has to his son. And so this is a quote from the book: "I came to see the streets and the schools as arms of the same beast. Fail in the schools and you'll be suspended and sent back to the same streets. The society could say he should have stayed in school and then wash its hands of him." So again, I know growing up, it was considered that school was my duty. It was the thing that I was supposed to be doing as a child. And I think many of us may have a similar experience. It's the place where we spend so much of our time, perhaps the majority of our time, from the ages of 5 to 18, maybe even before the age of 5. So if we think to ourselves, if there is a group of children who are not feeling welcomed in the classroom, or who are not welcome in the classroom, and more likely to be kicked out of the classroom, even from the tender ages of 3 and 4, what then might be those future projections? Those of us who work in early childhood are familiar with the research around how critical those young ages are, those early childhood ages for learning and development. And it's certainly not a lost cause if a child doesn't get what they need during those years. There are ways to supplement and, you know, attempt to bring a child back up to speed, but it's certainly unfortunate when that does not happen. So here we have a list of some of the causes of the school to prison pipeline as laid out by the ACLU. And the ones that have stars next to them are directly relevant to what we are speaking about today. So disciplinary and alternative schools, which is where a child might end up when expelled from school, suspended or expelled from school. Also in school policing and exclusionary discipline, which leads to harsher outcomes for children inside of the schools. Next slide, please. So in speaking of disciplinary and alternative schools, these are places where children sometimes get sent to in lieu of suspension and just being out of school completely. And some of the issues that researchers have found with disciplinary and alternative schools is that they may not have academic accountability standards. I should say they oftentimes do not have academic accountability standards. So when a child does return back to school, they often are ill-prepared, and eventually it seems easier to drop out or not attend traditional school than it does to stay in. So again, you know, a bit of a warning here about suspensions and expulsions. I would say that this slide is probably a bit less relevant for preschoolers, but still something to keep in mind. Something that has been raised before by parents and those who are in the school system who have seen how these things work out is that sometimes a child ends up being kind of tracked, like, and labeled as a problem child. So, okay, you've been kicked out of, you know, multiple preschools, or you've been, you know, expelled. And now, you know, you're the problem kid in kindergarten, and then you're the problem kid in middle school. And so it should just be noted that the child who ends up kicked out of multiple preschools may end up labeled and thus end up having a higher chance of being kicked out of school just throughout their life. Okay, so next we'll move on to tackling preschool suspension and expulsion. What is it that we can do about this issue? So ICS has 6 recommendations, and at the end of this webinar you'll see that we do have some briefs that were published, and in those briefs you'll find more details on these recommendations. So our 6 recommendations you'll see here: fair and appropriate policies, investing and supporting a highly skilled workforce, universal developmental and behavioral screenings, specialized supports for administrators and educators, strengthening family partnerships, and setting goals and tracking data. So what does it mean to be fair and appropriate? It means implementing policies without bias. And one of the things that can be done to do this is to minimize the use of exclusionary practices. And so exclusionary practices might not just be suspension and expulsion, but simply practices that keep a child away from where it's the first thing that we go to when a child exhibits quote unquote problem behaviors, keeping them away from their classmates or taking them out of the learning environment. You know, a child can be sitting in the classroom but placed in a corner, or, you know, just not given an opportunity to interact further with other children and with their teacher. So looking at exclusionary practices as a last resort. So of course the need for a highly skilled workforce. And I will say we do not say this as an organization without acknowledging that childcare workers and preschool workers are oftentimes not being paid a living wage. So it almost seems a bit contradictory to say, you know, we want this highly skilled workforce, but we also know that folks are not being paid what they need to exist and survive. So, you know, I'll get to that under supporting educators, but first, investing in educators with training. So training on implicit bias, and we'll have a slide about that afterwards, on equity and inclusion, what it means to be equitable, what it means to be inclusive, not just of children in the classrooms, but also of their caretakers and the people who love them and take care of them. And also exhibiting cultural humility, which you may hear often referred to as cultural competence. Just understanding if a child's background is unlike your own, being humble enough to say, okay, I'm going to take the time to learn the best ways to interact with this child and the best ways to interact with the adults who care for this child. So as far as supporting educators go, we know that there are many classrooms where educators are simply overwhelmed. There are too many children in the classroom. So supporting a 1 to 10 teacher to student ratio, monitoring and minimizing teacher stress. So that might mean having mental health professionals available for those who are in the classroom, and of course advocating for fair compensation, because we know that that is something that will definitely help to bolster the field. So what is implicit bias? Many times this is a term that we hear when things like suspension and expulsion come up, or unfair treatment of certain children in the classroom. The term implicit bias really refers to attitudes and stereotypes that an individual may have that then influences their behavior and their decision making. So the main thing to note about implicit bias is that it is thought to be unconscious, that, you know, we all have implicit biases and we may not know what those things are unless we actually have gone through an implicit bias training. So in this case, I'll just give a quick example before we get on to our next thing. In the case of preschool suspension and expulsions, knowing that the 3 Bs are the indicators of whether or not a child may be suspended or expelled at the ages of 3 and 4. Excuse me, one potential implicit bias could be that larger Black boys are dangerous. So maybe that child does something and another child does the same thing, but the implicit bias is, oh my goodness, you know, this is something that makes me afraid or makes other children afraid. So the reaction would be to put that child out of the classroom. So again, implicit bias, you may not necessarily know that that is something that you have that certain attitude, or that you have that certain stereotype. And biases in general are things that we all have. Some of them we are aware of, and then others are those implicit biases that we are unaware of. So preparing for aggressive and disruptive behavior. So these things happen in classrooms. It is the case that if you are a teacher in a classroom with children of any age, there's going to be something at some point that happens that is considered disruptive. So a few things that can be done, or one major thing that can be done, implementing universal developmental and behavioral screenings. And this is really to tend to the needs of children that we may not be aware of outside of screening. So really trying to preempt the disruptive behavior, and then if it's already happened, to be better able to deal with it. I'm just going to...
Mary, you have a Q&A if you want to go answer that.
Yes, I just saw that. Thank you, Lisa. This is for Charlene Sanchez. Literature from 19th century documents that there has been discrimination toward the African-American, including employment, educational, and medical African-American population. Is there research documenting why African-American males have the highest degree of suspension and expulsions currently? What does the research show? What has been done to address this concern? Charlene, thank you for that question. And yes, so in the original research on 250 preschoolers being expelled a day, and then also seeing the 3 Bs, big, black, and boy, it is made very clear in the research that the reason that this is happening is indeed implicit bias, because what the research has shown is that the Black boys who are in the classroom are not doing anything different from their peers, but they're being treated differently due to the implicit biases of preschoolers. And there is a Yale study from years ago that where much of this information was first documented, and that was kind of many folks' first education on this topic. It brought it to light. And that is one of the articles that we have linked at the end of this webinar as a resource. But the answer to your question, Charlene, would be that it is implicit bias. And what has been done to address this concern, I would say up until this point, probably the greatest thing that has been done is educating folks so that we know that it's happening, because you may be surprised by how many people don't know that preschool suspension and expulsion is something that actually occurs. And I would say that I did not know about it 6 years ago. I was not aware. And I certainly would not have thought that it was happening to this degree. And I see that your question isn't necessarily specifically about preschool suspension and expulsion, but I think the answer would be the same, that it is implicit bias. As for the remaining answers to the question, what has been done to address this, we'll get into that a bit more as we get further into the webinar. And I think you'll get some more tools and answers about what has been done and what can continue to be done to address the concern. So the benefits of specialized supports, which is another recommendation that Institute for Child Success has championed. So having the availability of mental health consultants and behavior coaches who help to identify needs of children in the classroom, and then in turn help educators to manage and prevent behavior and to promote development. And, you know, I want to say that we are aware as an organization that there needs to be increased access to mental health consultants in schools, and that it is an issue that has been flagged. It's certainly one that I've heard about over and over again. And I would also say mental health consultants, not just to help with children, but also to help with teachers and educators who oftentimes are dealing with things where they do need that mental support, mental and emotional support from a professional. Strengthening family partnerships. So working with families, even not just with families of problem children, but families in general, certainly helps to strengthen the relationship between teachers and educators and the children who are in the classroom. Working as a team certainly helps to identify concerns and leads to collaboration on potential solutions and the sharing of strategies. A bit later on in this webinar, we'll show some principles of equity and inclusion that ICS uses to guide us as an organization. And, you know, something that we like to highlight is how important it is to not just share concern for the child, but also to share concern for the adults that are home with the children. And that, of course, if those adults feel that they are being listened to, if those adults are well and have the tools that they need, then the children have a much higher likelihood of also being well and being successful in the classroom and outside of the home. Committing to learning more. So that refers to setting goals and tracking data, which then allows us to identify disparities. And, you know, one example of this that we've already seen where it's a potential blind spot and we just wish that we had more information is with private preschools. I am aware of one study that has been done around preschool suspension and expulsion in private preschools. And, you know, if we had more information, we would have a better idea of what's actually happening, because it is the case that many children do attend private and not public preschool. So we don't really know the extent of what is happening. Okay, we have our final poll question coming up. How long has preschool suspension and expulsion legislation been around? Okay, this is interesting. So the majority of you have said that legislation around preschool suspension and expulsion is non-existent. That's 63%, 10 people chose that. 31% of you said less than 5 years, and 6%, which apparently is one person, said more than 5 years. All right, well, can we go to the next slide? So there is precedent for preschool suspension and expulsion legislation. There is legislation specific to this issue in at least the following 7 states: Texas, California, Illinois, Connecticut, Maryland, New Jersey, and Ohio. And on this graphic, you'll also see, see the dates where the legislation was passed and put into effect, and with the first one, the earliest one being in California in 2014. So preschool suspension and expulsion legislation has been around since, for at least the past 6 years. So some common themes in the legislation that we have seen are that generally these pieces of legislation will cover pre-K through the 3rd grade. I think that there is one exception with those 7 states that were mentioned, but generally that'll be what it covers. Oftentimes it specifies out of school suspension, so not necessarily referring to being sent to the principal's office for 5 days or just out of the classroom for 5 days. And many times we see that there are exceptions noted, and those exceptions are threats to health and or safety. So one last thing that I'll note about the legislation, since many of you were not aware that it does exist, that is something, if there's interest, we can send out some more information on the legislation. I believe we talk about it in our briefs as well. But again, if there's interest, we'll be sure to do that. So our final section here for this webinar is called Proceeding with Equity in Mind. Here you'll see a word cloud, and I think I have showed this word cloud in so many presentations by this point. So for my my colleagues, sorry that you're seeing this yet again. But essentially, this is a word cloud that represents what 17 people thought about the word equity and what it means. And so with word clouds, the words that are much larger are the ones that have showed up with more frequency in people's responses. And this wasn't any type of formal survey. It was a very informal survey of questions that were asked around equity and inequity. And so you'll see from these responses that to many people, the word equity and being equitable means has ties to opportunity, fairness, equality, justice, access, diversity, and inclusion. And so I just wanted to use this word cloud to kind of open up our discussion around equity and what it means for this particular issue of preschool suspension and expulsion.
Mayor, we have a Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Okay, D, your question is, when you use the term preschool, oh, okay, Brian, do you want to answer that question?
No, I was just flagging it that you were about to answer, so it would associate your answer with the...
Okay, got it. So when you use the term preschool, are you also including infants and toddlers? Some of these very young children are also being suspended and expelled. So for the purposes of the 250 number, that is specific to 3 and 4 year olds, but the general term, I would say, generally speaking, preschool suspension and expulsion can be used to also cover infants and toddlers, even though they may technically not be in preschool, because we know that it is something that is an issue that has come up before in sessions where we presented on it, where people have given their own stories of their 1-year-olds being kicked out. And you would think, what is it exactly that a baby does to be kicked out of their childcare program? So while the 250 number is specific to 3 and 4 year olds, when we talk about preschool suspension and expulsion, or just suspension and expulsion in early childhood, it is with the awareness that it is happening at younger ages, younger than 3 as well. And then Taylor Bagwell has a question. For the exceptions to the legislation, health and safety, is that kind of a loophole? Safety could be related to feelings of not being safe as a result of implicit bias. Are health and safety defined in that legislation? So Taylor, if I'm being completely honest, that is something that I have been concerned with as well. I think that they could potentially be loopholes. That is the answer that I have for health and safety. I will go and take a take a closer look around how it's defined, because I do believe that it is the safety piece. And of course, it's, you know, do you feel like a child is causing harm? And as you stated, whether or not you feel that way can certainly be a result of your implicit bias. You may feel threatened by one child, but not threatened by another child. You may think that one child hitting is not such a big deal, but a bigger child hitting is a very big deal. So I will go back and take a look at the specifics and see if, you know, how well it's defined. But it is kind of I wouldn't call it a red flag, but it's kind of a yellow flag that has been raised in my mind as well, because it might be meant to be objective, but there are ways that those could also be very subjective and remain harmful for children of color and other children who are experiencing the impact of implicit bias from those who are in the classroom with them. Okay, so getting a solid definition of equity, and we borrowed these definitions from the Race, Equity, and Inclusion Action Guide produced by the Annie Casey Foundation in 2014. So you'll see many of the same themes from the word cloud, being just, impartial, being fair. The second definition is one that I really enjoy, because trying to understand and giving people what they need to enjoy full, healthy lives is really so holistic and fully encompasses more the spirit probably of what we are thinking about when we say equity, and we say that we want to be more, more equitable, really meeting folks where they are. So here you'll see on our Leading with Equity lens, I won't read these things off, but these are the 4 principles that I referred to earlier that as an organization we use to guide us, our principles of equity and inclusion. These are things that we think about each day and in our work. And so for us, equity and inclusion is not a separate department, but really principles that we want to be interwoven through all that we do at ICS. And it includes making sure that we are including the voices of populations that may be marginalized. So equity versus equality. A lot of times when I throw out the question, hey, you know, do you all know what equity is? Is there a difference between equality? And people will say it's the children on the boxes. So here are the children on the boxes, or the people or figures on the boxes. And so one is showing what it might mean to be equal, and another one is showing what it means to have equity or to be equitable. Essentially highlighting that equity oftentimes does not mean sameness, because in the first rectangle, we see that the same thing or the same size boxes are provided for each of the people here, but they have different views of the field. One is completely obstructed, so they're not having the same access. Whereas in the second rectangle, we see that boxes that are provided for the figures to stand on are given according to need and what it is that they need to be able to have the same access. Next slide. So another look at equity versus equality. The major difference with this image from the first one is that there is a third rectangle where the obstructions are no longer there. And Lisa, if you could click one more time, or 2 more times. So that third rectangle shows us what it looks like when systemic barriers are removed. So the third rectangle, I would say, is an ideal situation, whereas the second one is us as a society acknowledging that there are systemic barriers, so that we need to have things in place that make things equitable, more equitable for folks, whether it's our young children or their families or whomever it may be. So also a point that we'd like to make, access does not equal inclusion. And so I think that many of us that have joined the webinar do work in the early childhood space and either directly provide services for young children or are more similar to organizations like ICS, where we champion those services and we try to educate and rally policymakers so that children can have access to better quality services. So the main point here, I think, when it comes to preschool suspension and expulsion is that just because a child has access to quality childcare or a quality preschool does not mean that the environment is one of inclusion, and specifically not one of inclusion, not just for the child, but also for their caretaker. And so when we speak of inclusion, we're speaking about the experience that one has after being let in the door and given access, the voices that are being heard when you do have a seat at the table, and whether or not there is a sense of belonging. And so I will wrap up with this quote. It's adopted from the Brown v. Board decision from Chief Justice Earl Warren, and it was the decision on segregation in the classroom in the US. And so inequity and bias generate a feeling of inferiority as to a child's status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely to ever be undone. So when we're in this work, this is just a great reminder of some of the impacts that inequity and bias, whether it's implicit bias or explicit bias, can have on children. I'd argue that, perhaps some of the damage can be undone. So it's not, the point here is not to be fatalistic, but to just really understand that there are mental and emotional consequences to the things that happen in classrooms, to the things that happen in childcare centers, and that inequities and biases, whether they're conscious or subconscious, really are really harmful for children and harmful for society. So I hope it's something that, we all remember and think about as we move forward with our work. It's great that we are, here today to be educated on the topic, and, and I know that it is something difficult. Occasionally I'll share that I taught for a brief period, for about a 4-year period when I was in college, and there was an incident where a desk was thrown at me. So I know that there are challenging behaviors in classrooms. So this is not a saying that, all children exhibit perfect behavior at all times and that educators are always wrong, but really looking at the challenges that we face and finding ways to approach them with equity in mind and with the well-being of children, and also the well-being of our educators, and being able to provide the necessary support in these environments for everyone involved. Okay, so we have had several questions and answers, and I think we have another one here from D. Steglin, who is one of our senior fellows. Question from D. Steglin: how can ICS and other agencies provide support and resources to childcare and preschool administrators and directors who want to meet the needs of children with behavioral issues? They feel responsible for all of the children's well-being, and sometimes a child with disruptive behaviors may be threatening to the parents of the other children. Directors have to balance the well-being of the child in need with the well-being of the other children, often without sufficient support or tools to address the problems, rather than entirely intention or implicit bias. So D, that is a very big question. And one of the primary ways that we attempt to provide support and resources is through our research. And again, we do have 2 briefs that kind of get into the details of what our recommendations are with these issues. And they do include support, not just for children, but also for those who are in the classroom. And those of us who either have children or there are children in our lives, young children that we love very much, and who may have been in situations where there may have been a child in their class who was disruptive, and we may even feel that the child that we love was being threatened or might have been unsafe in the classroom. To that, I'll say that, you know, the point of the legislation, for example, is for suspension and expulsion and just exclusionary practices to be a last resort and not a first resort. And by having more mental health professionals available in the fields, and also having developmental screenings as something that becomes the norm, perhaps disruptive behaviors that are truly disruptive behaviors and not the result of implicit bias, perhaps those are things that can be, perhaps the issues that cause those behaviors can be identified before the child enters the classroom or very early on. So those are, you know, that's the response that I would have to that. Anyone else, Brian or Dee, if you want to comment on that yourself, we can unmute you. Just let us know.
And Dee, I don't know if you know this, but we can, if you're not unmuted and you want to respond, just ping us in the chat window, and we'll make sure that you can. But Mary, I didn't have anything additional to add to that.
Okay, thanks. And again, you know, I do want to stress that this is not this is not an easy issue. It's certainly, yeah, there are things that really make it more complicated, and I would even say, you know, touchy, because it you know, I've been in situations where we're giving this presentation and there might be someone who is a director of a center who feels that they don't have enough support and everything, you know, and the presentation is making it look like, you know, just directors and educators are, you know, bad people or have bad intentions. And that's not necessarily the case. But I think that it's still that, you know, regardless, we still have a, you know, a job to do as far as educating on the cases that might really be implicit bias, because it does, you know, it does indeed happen. And I think that it's tricky managing the expectations of parents while also looking out for the well-being of all children, while also considering the level of support that is needed for educators in the classroom. And all that goes to say, you know, my hat goes off to anyone who enters a classroom each day, because I know that it's not an easy job. Okay, at the moment, we don't have any open questions. Just putting it out there, seeing if there are any additional questions. Okay, Lisa, can we go to the next slide that has the resources? I just want to walk us all through them for a bit. The first two resources that are listed here are ICS briefs, preschool suspension and expulsion, defining the issues, and then exploring the prevalence of suspension and expulsion practices in childcare settings in South Carolina, because of course that is where we are headquartered. So those, you know, those briefs go into more detail than this presentation has gone into. And then the third one, new data reveals 250 preschoolers are suspended or expelled every day. Much of our data came from that study. And then the next two are more specific to Black boys. Black students bear an even brunt of discipline, and also Black boys in crisis, is punishment too harsh? And then the final resource that we have here is the original Yale study that has really been the basis of much of the research around preschool suspension and expulsion. And that's the Do Early Educators' Implicit Biases Regarding Sex and Race Relate to Behavior Expectations and Recommendations of Preschool Expulsions and Suspensions. This is something that we can send out to all of our attendees. I think, Brian, you've included the links in the chat as well, but these links also in the document are embedded, and you'd be able to click on them to access each one. So I see we're at 12:24. We do have a few minutes if there are any remaining lingering questions.
And Mary, we have an attendee whose hand is raised. Dee, I think.
Yeah, it's me.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, first of all, I think this presentation is really helpful, and I think the data speak for themselves. When we have data that really shows the disproportionate number of children from minority groups and gender, then we have to listen to that. And you're right, it's really a very complex issue, but I think there are some school districts in the US that are starting to deal with it. Chicago Public Schools are hiring, they've begun hiring mental health specialists for all of the early childhood classrooms. And it's really, it takes work because it's having a specialist be able to observe and assess the needs of a particular child, but also communicating with the teacher, with the administrators, with the parents, and getting everybody on the same page. But I have seen a couple of cases, one in South Carolina, where, and this was in a 4K classroom in a public school, where the teacher really wanted, and she knew what the resources she needed and she couldn't get them, and the decision to expel was entirely the administrators. So teachers are sometimes caught in the middle too. They have more understanding of child development and what some of the solutions are, but the administrators don't necessarily understand child development, or they don't have sufficient resources or funds to do behavioral assessments and those kinds of needs. So I thought your presentation was really helpful, though.
Thank you, Jean. Thanks for, highlighting that. And, it's unfortunate that that does happen, but it's a great point. And to everyone who is on the line for the webinar, Dee Stegman is not just one of our senior fellows, but she's also the author of one of our briefs, the Preschool Suspension and Expulsion, Defining the Issues brief. Any other questions or comments? Taylor Bagwell's question, does ICS offer trainings for school districts about this? Yes, we do. And we'd be happy to connect with you about it, Taylor. Okay, if there are no additional questions or raised hands, then we are happy to give you back an extra 3 minutes in your day.
There's one more.
Okay.
We're good.
Okay, we're all good, Lisa. All right, so unless I'm missing anyone, will the slides be available? Yes, we can send these slides around, and they will also have a recording available. That was from Mary Matthew.
The slide will be on our website shortly.
All right, I think we can wrap it up. Thank you all for joining us here today. And please feel free to reach out if you have questions that occur to you after the fact. We're happy to keep the conversation going and also to provide any support that we can.
Thank you.